bio with this video. We are going to wrap up chapter 15, summarize how Darwin finished off presenting his case about his evolutionary theory. So we talked about in our last video with natural selection, artificial selection, survival of the fittest, all those main points that he brought up. So the next point that he brought up in his book was this idea of descent with modification. So natural selection, it produces organisms that have different structures, they establish different niches, and they occupy different habitats. So natural selection, it causes organisms to change over time, and they're all going to be doing different things. And because of this, each species has descended with changes from other species over time. And so Darwin called this principle descent with modification. So modification is simply just to mean to change, and so Darwin referred to the idea that organisms were changing over time as the idea of descent with modification. And this descent with modification implies that all living organisms are related to one another, and so this is a principle known as common descent. So that just means at some point along the line, in terms of evolutionarily speaking, we all descended from one common ancestor that kind of gave rise to all the other different groups of animals and all the different groups of other organisms as well. And so this is the principle known as common descent. And so now we're going to look at specific evidence, again, that things that we can actually hold, things we can look at, things that we can prove to show that evolution did occur and that Darwin wasn't just making all this up. So the specific evidence that Darwin gathered that really showed that evolution would occur was that he looked and noticed that the living things have been evolving on Earth for millions of years, and evidence for this could be found in the fossil record. So that's number one. So that's another important thing you're going to need to know: the fossil record, the geographical distribution of living species. So that's the geographical distribution. Again, we've been saying that over and over, what that means, just where they're located. Homologous structures, that's going to be a new word, of living organisms, and similarities in early development or embryology. So these four things are going to be really important as evidence that Darwin has that evolution did actually occur. So for our first one is the fossil record. So Darwin saw fossils as a record of the history of life on Earth, which that's exactly what it is. It preserves animals that used to be alive, or plants that used to be alive, and it preserves them for us to look at today. So by comparing fossils from older rock layers with fossils from younger rock layers, scientists could document that life on Earth has in fact changed over time. So they could look at this rock was from 5 million years ago, and this rock was from 15 million years ago, and they could see there's a definite difference and some similarities actually as well in the life. So we could see that life has changed and kind of stayed the same over time. And so for our next one is geographic distribution of living species. So Darwin decided that all his finches that he looked at, because remember in our activity Darwin thought he only had one species of finch, but actually he had 13 different species. So he decided that all of those finches could have descended with modification from a common mainland ancestor. So that means at one time they were all one group of finch, but then let's say part of that species moved to one island, part moved to another, and then from there they all developed different beaks based off the type of food that was available. And Darwin's theory was that species now living on different continents had descended from different ancestors. So if you lived on South America compared to living in Asia, most likely you had a different ancestor. However, one kind of flaw that he noticed was that some animals on each continent were living under the same conditions, so they kind of had similar plants, similar temperature, similar surroundings, similar habitats, so they were exposed to similar pressures of natural selection. So that means they had to kind of come up with similar adaptations to help them survive. And because of these similar selection processes, different animals ended up evolving certain features in common. So that means that there could be two animals, they're completely unrelated, they have nothing in common when we look at their DNA. However, let's say one lives along the coast in Africa and one lives along the coast in South America. Now they're going to be exposed to similar pressures. They're both going to be in a sandy area, maybe high temperatures, high wind, high water, so they're going to develop similar features. So one example that they gave was actually a group of rodents that they're similar but they're unrelated. So if you look up top, we have a beaver and a muskrat, both kind of up more in North America area, and then if we go down south into South America, we have what is called a capybara and a coypu. I believe is how you pronounce that one. And if you look, these animals are all unrelated. However, they look very similar because they kind of have been living in similar environments. So over time, they've been exposed to similar things, so they develop similar features, and that is why they look the way they do today. So it's pretty interesting on how natural selection works. This is just further proof that unrelated species can develop similar things, and then therefore that's just showing that natural selection is occurring because it's picking the most favorable process or favorable adaptations to help these organisms survive. So that's how geographical distribution can tell us that organisms are related. So our next way is we can look at homologous body structure. So this is going to be another new word for us, so it's going to be an important one to know. So structures that have different mature forms but develop from the same embryonic tissues are called homologous structures. So what that means is we're going to kind of see a picture here in a second. Well, actually, I'll wait till we get to the picture to explain it more. And so similarities and differences in homologous structures help biologists group animals according to how recently they shared a last common ancestor. So the example of homologous structure is looking at actually the foot bones and the leg bones of different animals. So if we look, a turtle, an alligator, a bird, and a mammal. So they all have very different functions for their legs or their arms. So the turtle obviously is going to be more swimming. Alligator and a turtle would be the most similar. But then we look at a bird, it's formed a wing, and a mammal, it's actually just formed a leg for running. And so they're all used for very different things. However, if we look at the inside of the bones, we can actually see that there are very similar structures present in there. So they all have almost the exact same bones found inside of each, the legs, the wings, and the mammal leg. However, they're just used for all very different things. So because they have the same bones, we can tell at some point they were related, and they just now have descent with modification to where they can just carry out their own individual function. So that is how homologous structures work. However, not all of our homologous structures will serve important functions, so they're not all going to be responsible for a leg. So the organs of many animals are so reduced in size that they are just vestiges or traces of homologous organs in other species, and these are called vestigial organs. An example of a vestigial organ that might be in humans now is our appendix. We think that it was probably used more for when we would eat more plant matter, and since we don't eat plant matter as much, our appendix is slowly just kind of going to wither away. We're not going to have a use for it anymore. And so our last evidence is the similarities in embryology. So the early stages or embryos of many animals with backbones are very similar. And so we can look at, again, an early development of a cat is very similar to early development of a human. And these same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order and in similar patterns to produce the tissues of organs of all vertebrates. So if you take Bio 2, we'll talk about this more in depth then, about how if we look at evolution, we can actually look at early development to tell us how closely related things are. So to wrap this chapter up, we're just going to give a summary of Darwin's theory. So individual organisms differ, and some of this variation is heritable, meaning it can be passed on to their offspring. And organisms will produce more offspring than can survive, and many that do survive do not reproduce, so that's going to kind of go into the survival of the fittest. Not all of them are going to make it. And because more organisms are produced that can survive, they compete for limited resources, which again we've been talking about. And individuals best suited to their environment survive and reproduce most successfully. So again, white rabbit living in the snow is going to reproduce better than the brown rabbit. And these organisms will pass their traits on to their offspring, and other individuals will therefore die or leave fewer offspring. And this process of natural selection will cause species to change over time. And then species alive today are descended with modification from their ancestral species that lived in the distant past. And this process, by which diverse species evolve from common ancestors, unites all organisms on Earth into a single tree of life, meaning that all organisms on Earth are in fact related at some point. And so evolutionary theory today, there has been many advances in biology, geology, and physics that have confirmed and expanded most of Darwin's hypotheses, so people are still studying this stuff today to show that it is occurring. And evolutionary theory will continue to change as new data is gathered and new ways of thinking arise. So that's it for Chapter 15. Let me know if you have any questions.